Welcome to Letters to Corinthians, Lesson 9, where we will be looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 11. We have a lot to unpack in this chapter. We're going to hurry through without being rushed, and we're going to give you some interesting insights to think about. As Holiness Pentecostals, we are probably already familiar with 1 Corinthians chapter 11. It's the hair chapter or the head covering chapter, right? So when we talk about the head covering issue or men and women's hair, we often relate this to the holiness issue. And it is a matter of holiness and gender distinction and all of that. But the main reason why this issue is important is because the head covering, whatever it is in direct relationship to headship, as Paul laid the foundation in 1 Corinthians 11:3. But I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. The word head or kephale in Greek has reference to someone in a superior rank, a chief or a leader. The word head refers to someone who is an authority over someone else. It is used this way many times in the Septuagint Old Testament and the Greek New Testament. For example, Kephale is used to describe Jephthah as the head or captain over Gilead. Kephale is used of David when he prayed that God would make him the head or ruler over the heathens. In Isaiah 7:8 through 9, Kephale is used to describe both the capital or ruling city of a province and also the ruler of that capital city. In Jeremiah 31:7, Kephale refers to Israel as being the head or chief of the nations. And then in Lamentations 1:5, Kephale is used to describe the adversaries who became the chief over Jerusalem through her captivity. Then in the New Testament, Paul says in Ephesians 1:22 and Colossians 2:10 that Christ, through Calvary, is made the head, the kephale, the authority over all things. In Ephesians 4:15 and Colossians 1:18, Christ is the head of the church, meaning that Christ is the one we obey. And in Ephesians 5:23, Paul used the identical language as 1 Corinthians 11:3, where he says that wives are to submit themselves to their own husbands because the husband is the head, the kephale of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and the church is subject to Christ. So that language of submit and subject obviously shows that head or kephale is referring to someone in authority over someone else. So in 1 Corinthians 11:3, Paul is dealing with the issue of headship or someone who is an authority over someone else. Specifically, the husband as the head or authority over his wife, and the head covering, whatever it is the symbol of our submission to our head. As one writer put it, the head covering is the object lesson of headship. 1 Corinthians 11:4, Paul states, every man praying or prophesying having his head covered dishonors his head. The phrase having his head covered is more of a commentary than a translation. The phrase having his head covered in Greek is kata kephales ekon, which literally translates is having something down from his head. And you'll notice that there's no direct object given in this verse. So what the something is not specifically stated in the text. So the phrase kata kephales ekon in and of itself does not tell us specifically what it is that a man is not to have down from his head. This has to be determined from the context. And so some of you may say, well, Brother Weatherly, what this passage means is that a man is not to wear a hat when he prays. Well, I want you to keep in mind that in the Old Testament, the priest and the Levites commonly prayed and prophesied wearing a mitre or a turban. It was part of their required uniform. They were commanded by God to wear this garment on top of their head. Take, for example, Zacharias, John the Baptist's father in Luke 167, when he prophesied in the temple, he was required to wear this hat or turban on top of his head. Even Orthodox Jewish men were required to wear a prayer shawl on their head during prayer and worship time in the temple or synagogue. So either these men were dishonoring their heads every time they prayed and prophesied wearing a turban or a prayer shawl, or 1 Corinthians 11:4 is not talking about a hat or some kind of fabric covering your head. But you might be thinking, yeah, Brother Weatherly, that was the Old Testament, and 1 Corinthians 11:4 is in the New Testament. Well, I'm glad that you brought that up. The Jewish apostles after Calvary continued in temple and synagogue prayer and worship. Luke 24:53 and Acts 2:46 says they were continually in the temple worshiping and blessing God. In Acts 3 and 1, Peter and John went to the temple at the hour of prayer. Acts 13:14, Paul and Barnabas entered into the synagogue on the Sabbath day. Acts 17:10, Paul and Silas were in the synagogue. Now, how did these Jewish apostles participate in prayer in the temple or the synagogue without wearing a prayer shawl? The early Jewish church continued to worship in the synagogues. James 2 and 2, James said, if there come one in your assembly, a man with a gold ring. The word assembly here is synagoge, which is the Greek word for synagogue. They were still meeting in the synagogues. In Acts 1826, it was in the synagogue where Aquila and Priscilla heard Apollos preaching boldly. And then in Acts 19 and 8, for 3 months, Paul and his company spent their time preaching and debating in the synagogues. So these Jewish men would not have been allowed to enter the temple or synagogue without a prayer shawl. Yet, Paul said if a man prays or prophesies with his head covered, he dishonors his head, thus showing conclusively that a hat, a shawl, or some other piece of clothing cannot be the covering Paul was speaking about. Otherwise, the apostles and the Jewish men of the early church dishonored their head every time they prayed in the temple and synagogue. Now, this is just one of the many reasons why we believe that when Paul said that if a man prays or prophesies having something down his head, that Paul was talking about a man growing long hair, long enough to hang down his head. Even the New Strong's Expanded Dictionary of the Bible, page 1167, states in 1 Corinthians 11:4, having his head covered is literally having something down the head, signifying that hair that hangs down is too long for a man. So kata kephale ekon must be understood in the context of the passage, and I'm going to show you that the context is dealing with hair, that which can be shorn or shaven. 1 Corinthians 11:5, Paul says, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is one and the same if her head were shaved. Now, one of the errors of the second covering doctrine is that they teach that a woman is only required to be covered when she prays or prophesies. However, this is not what the passage says. You can read 1 Corinthians 11:5 from now until Jesus comes, and you'll find nowhere where Paul said that a woman is to be covered only when she prays or prophesies. That's something that's got to be read into the text. The phrase praying and prophesying is not a conditional clause, meaning that this is the only time a woman is to be covered, or that this is the only situation in which she dishonors her head by being uncovered. Rather, it is simply an incidental statement, meaning that the statement is accompanying but not a major part of the passage, or that this is simply something that is liable to happen as a consequence of not being covered. For example, if we were to say, if a woman runs barefooted, she dishonors her feet. Now, does this mean that she dishonors her feet only when she runs barefooted? Or is it possible that she could dishonor her feet while doing other activities while barefooted? If you simply walk barefooted in certain parts of my yard, you'll certainly dishonor your feet from all the stickers that are in the grass. So, does that mean that a woman is only required to wear shoes when she's running? Well, obviously not. Try that the next time you go to a restaurant. Try to go out to eat. So, if we take praying and prophesying as a conditional clause, and not an incidental statement like the second covering doctrine teaches, then what other passages must we understand as conditional clauses? For example, Mark 11:25 says, "And whenever you stand praying, if you have anything against anyone, forgive him, that your Father in heaven may also forgive you your trespasses." So does this mean that if we're not standing and praying, that we don't have to forgive them? As long as we're sitting down and praying, we don't have to forgive someone that's done something against us. You see, it's not a conditional clause, it's simply an incidental statement. What about James 5:13? Is any among you suffering? Let him pray. Does this mean that only those who are suffering can pray? So if you are suffering, you can pray. And then when you pray, you need to be standing when you're suffering. And when you stand praying, then you can forgive someone, right? Or are these all just simply incidental statements and not conditional clauses? James goes on to say, is any cheerful? Let him sing praises. So if we apply the second covering doctrine's logic on 1 Corinthians 11:6 to James 5:13, then those of you that come to church sad and broken don't need to sing praises, because according to their logic, James 5:13 restricts singing praises only to those who are cheerful. No, that's not what it's talking about. We all understand that's not the case. Each of these, just like 1 Corinthians 11:5 through 6, are simply incidental statements. They are not conditional clauses. Also notice this, 1 Corinthians 11:6 through 7. If the woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it's a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. So is it a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaved only when she prays or prophesies? Notice this, since the dishonor of being uncovered is directly linked to the shame of being shaved, you cannot say that the covering is only required when a woman prays or prophesies. By the same token, you would be saying that it is a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaved only when she prays or prophesies. Paul goes on to say, for a man indeed ought not to cover his head, for inasmuch as he is the image and glory of God. So is man the image and glory of God only when he prays or prophesies? Well, the obvious answer is no. Thus, the covering in 1 Corinthians 11 is not limited to only to when a person prays or prophesies, and it is not limited only to when you are in a church service. 1 Corinthians 11 and 5, Paul says, "But every woman that prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is one and the same as if she were shaved." The word uncovered in Greek is akatakaluptos, from a, meaning not, and katakalupto, which means wholly covered or completely covered. So the word akatakaluptos means not fully covered. Once again, the term uncovered in and of itself does not indicate what the covering material is. It's the context that tells us what the covering is. To uncover the head is a biblical idiom that refers to hair. Notice in Numbers 5:18 that a woman who was accused of adultery, the priest would set her before the Lord and uncover the woman's head. The word uncovered here in Hebrew is parah. Jusinius's Hebrew lexicon, page 690, says that parah comes from the idea of loosening, casting off the garments, and he defines the word as to make naked, for example, the head, Numbers 5:18, especially by shaving. Marvin Vincent states that among the Jews, a woman convicted of adultery had her head shorn. And we see this idea that uncovering relates to a person's hair. Another example is in Leviticus 10:6 concerning the death of Nadab and Abihu. Moses told Aaron and his younger sons, "Do not uncover your heads nor tear your clothes." And we know from other passages that it was a common practice in the Old Testament for a man to tear his clothes and shave his head when he was in mourning. Notice Job 120. Then Job arose, tore his robe, and shaved his head. And this is what Aaron and his sons were told not to do. Don't uncover your heads or tear your clothes. So, from an Old Testament usage, the idea of uncovering the head refers to hair. Now, the King James Version says in 1 Corinthians 11:5, "For that is even all one as if she was shaven." However, I want you to notice from the Greek text that there is no as if statement of comparison. The Greek text literally says, "For it is one and the same having been shaven." As a matter of fact, the New King James translates this as one and the same. In other words, for a woman to be uncovered is identical to being shaved. We're not talking about something that is simply comparable or similar to. We're talking about something that is one and the same or identical to being shaven. And what is it that is shaven? It's hair. The only way that uncovered can be one and the same thing or identical to being shaven is for the covering material to be hair, that which can be shaven. 1 Corinthians 11:5, Paul said for a woman to be uncovered is one and the same with being shaven. Notice that Paul also used this one and the same phrase in 1 Corinthians 12:11. But one and the same Spirit. The King James translators actually rendered this one and the self same Spirit. That is, the identical Spirit. So I want you to notice that in both passages, Paul used the identical terms, one and the same. In 1 Corinthians 12:11, Paul wasn't saying that the Spirit who gives a word of knowledge or a word of wisdom is comparable to the Spirit that works miracles. No, Paul was saying that it is the identical Spirit that works all the gifts, one and the same, the identical spirit. One and the same in 1 Corinthians 12:11 means the identical spirit. Well, Paul used the same one and the same language in 1 Corinthians 11 and 5, just one chapter prior, to describe an uncovered woman as being one and the same or identical with being shaven. Notice how 1 Corinthians 11:5 is translated in other Bible versions. The Common English Bible says it is the same thing as having her head shaved. The Holman Christian Standard Bible translates, since that is one and the same as having her head shaved. The New International Version says it is the same as having her head shaved. The Concordant Literal Version says, for it is one and the same as being shaven. The only way uncovered can be one and the same with shaven is if uncovered has reference to a woman's hair. 1 Corinthians 11 and 6, Paul said, for if the woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it's be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. And so this phrase, let her even be shorn, is not a command for a woman to cut her hair short. Rather, Paul was saying that this is the logical conclusion or what consistency demands if a woman is not wholly covered. In other words, Paul is making a logical argument. He's saying if you're going to do A, then you might as well do B, which is even more severe than A. And since it is a shame to do B, don't even do A. So if a woman is not fully covered, then she might as well cut her hair short. But since it is a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. So once again, the context of a woman being covered is dealing with that which can be shorn or shaven, and that is hair. 1 Corinthians 11:6, for if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. So the phrase, but if, is not a question of whether or not it is a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, but it is a rhetorical statement of fact that it is indeed a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven. The phrase but if in Greek is ede. Bauer Danker's lexicon says that this is a marker of a condition existing in fact or hypothetical. A.T. Robertson's Word Pictures, commenting on this passage, says that ede refers to a condition assumed to be true. For example, the phrase ede is also used in Matthew 6:30. Now, if God so clothed the grass of the field, which means since God clothes the field, will he not also take care of us? Jesus wasn't questioning whether or not God clothes the fields with grass. He was presenting something as true. Since God clothes the field with grass. And this is the same phrase as 1 Corinthians 11:6. Since it is a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven. As a matter of fact, this is exactly how 1 Corinthians 11:6 is translated in several other English versions. Notice the easy to read version, but it is shameful for a woman to cut off her hair or to shave her head. The English Standard Version, but since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head. The Good News Bible translates this, and since it is a shameful thing for a woman to shave her head or cut her hair. And then the Orthodox Jewish Bible states, but since it is in fact a thing of shame for an Isha to be shorn or to be shaved. So notice that Paul said that if a woman is not covered, then she might as well be shorn. The word shorn is from the Greek word kero, which means to cut the hair short. This word is used most often for shearing the wool from sheep. Thayer's Greek lexicon, page 343, says that kero in 1 Corinthians 11:6 absolutely refers to cutting short the hair of the head. So watch this. Paul's logical argument of consistency takes us from one act to a more severe act. If you're going to do A, then you might as well do B. And B is a more severe act than A. So don't even do A. We might tell our children, if you're going to steal a piece of bubble gum, then you might as well rob a bank. See, we're making a logical argument of consistency by going from one act to a more severe act. If you're going to steal a piece of bubble gum, then you might as well rob a bank. And since robbing a bank is a felony, don't even steal a piece of bubble gum. This is a logical argument of consistency. And we have equal relationships on both sides of the antithesis. The less severe act of stealing a piece of bubble gum and the more severe act of robbing or stealing money from a bank. Another example of a true antithesis is if a woman goes out in public wearing a halter top, she might as well go out naked. But since it is a shame to go out in public naked, then let her not go out in a halter top. Again, this is a true antithesis because we have equal relationship on both sides, partial nudity and full nudity. It is a valid argument because we are trying to explain to you why a woman shouldn't go dressed in public in a halter top. Doing A logically would lead to B, which is a more severe act. And since B is a shame, don't even do A. The second covering doctrine explanation of 1 Corinthians 11:6 is if a woman doesn't wear a veil, she might as well cut her hair short. But since it is a shame for a woman to cut her hair short or to be shaven, let her wear a veil. Now, people, that is a false antithesis. It does not have equal relationship on both sides of the equation. They're not even similar. It's not even a valid argument. It's totally asinine to say that if a woman doesn't wear a veil, she might as well cut her hair short. That makes about as much sense as saying if you don't wear sunglasses, you might as well shave your eyebrows. But since it's a shame to shave your eyebrows, you need to wear sunglasses. Both of these examples are examples of a false antithesis. So Paul said if a woman is not covered, she might as well cut her hair short. Cutting the hair short is the more severe act. And notice that in the context of being covered, Paul is talking about that which can be shorn or shaven, which is hair. A woman's hair is the context of the passage. In order to have equal relationship in the antithesis, both the covering and that which is shorn must be of the same material, and that material is obviously hair, that which can be shorn or shaven. So if cutting the hair short is the more severe act of logical conclusion, then it stands to reason that the less severe act of a woman not being covered refers to a woman trimming or cutting her hair any length. And by the same token, let her be covered then refers to a woman not cutting her hair at all. So the context of 1 Corinthians 11:6 is for if the woman trims or cuts her hair any length, she might as well cut her hair short. But since it is a shame for a woman to be cut short or shaven, let the woman not cut her hair at all. Everything in the context deals with a woman's hair. We have equal relationship on both sides of the antithesis. We have the natural flow that the original act leads to a logical consistency demanding a more severe act. We have Paul's acknowledgement that since the more severe act is shameful or a disgrace to a woman, that she should not even participate in the original act. This argument is both logical and sound. Where the second covering doctrine makes a big mistake is that they do not acknowledge that the word shorn or caro means cut the hair short. So they look at our understanding of the passage as silly or nonsensical and say, well, you say that uncovered means if a woman cuts her hair. So then you would have Paul saying, if a woman cuts her hair, she might as well cut her hair. And that doesn't make any sense. And I agree. But the reason it doesn't make any sense is because they have misunderstood the word shorn. Even in English, if a person was to go into a barber shop and tell the barber, yeah, I'd like for you to shear my hair, which shear is just the present tense of shorn. If you told them to shear your hair, they're not just going to grab the scissors and start trimming the split ends. They're going to grab the clippers, and hopefully it's got one of those guards on it. It's going to look real close to my hairdo, and my head's not shorn, my head's shaved. So shorn means to crop off close to the skin, as one of the second covering brethren acknowledges, but to shave means to remove the hair completely. So we talk about the fact that Paul made this argument of logical conclusion. If a woman be not covered, let her also be shorn. And shorn doesn't simply mean to cut your hair without reference to length, like trimming the split ends. Shorn, or the Greek word kero, means to cut the hair short. Notice how the lexicons, the Greek dictionaries, define the word kero. The Abbott Smith Manual Lexicon of the New Testament says to cut short the hair, shear a sheep, have one's hair cut off. 1 Corinthians 11:6. So when Paul used the word kero in 1 Corinthians 11:6, he wasn't talking about simply trimming the hair. He was referring to cutting the hair short or cutting it off. As a matter of fact, that's the way the word is translated in many Bible versions. Thayer's lexicon defines kero as to shear a sheep, to get or let be shorn absolutely, of shearing or cutting short the hair. 1 Corinthians 11:6. Spiros Zodhiates' Complete Word Studies Dictionary of the New Testament says, "Kero, to shear, especially to shave the head." Then on 1 Corinthians 11:6, he says it indicates cutting the hair very short. So again, the context of 1 Corinthians 11:6 is, for if the woman trims or cuts her hair any length, she might as well cut her hair short. But since it is a shame for a woman to be cut short or shaven, let the woman not cut her hair at all. Everything in the context deals with a woman's hair. As a matter of fact, even the translators of the New International Version recognize that 1 Corinthians 11 is talking about hair. 1 Corinthians 11 in the New International Version offers the following alternate translation in their footnote of 1 Corinthians 11, 4 through 7. Every man who prays or prophesies with long hair dishonors his head. And every woman who prays or prophesies with no covering of hair on her head dishonors her head. She is just like one of the shorn women. If a woman has no covering, let her be now with short hair. But since it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair shorn or shaved, she should grow it again. A man ought not to have long hair. And so the footnote translates verse 6 as a Greek cessative. If a woman has no covering, let her be for now with short hair. And so moving on into verse 10, Paul makes this odd statement that has caused some controversy in the Oneness Pentecostal churches over the last decade or so. 1 Corinthians 11:10, Paul says, "For this cause ought a woman have power on her head because of the angels." Now, there's been a difference of opinion among Pentecostals as to what exactly this passage is teaching. For example, in one of the Purpose Institute outlines for the New Testament epistles classes, it states, Paul said that long uncut hair on a woman is a glory to her. It is a sign of her submission to her husband and to her God. There is angelic power she brings into her home and into her church because of her long hair. And for some years, some of those in the UPCI ranks, women have been encouraged to let down their hair in worship to somehow enhance their spiritualism or even lay their hair across their sick children in prayer, as if letting down her hair channels some sort of angelic power or dispatches angels to help in aiding prayer. Now, I don't want you to misunderstand. I certainly agree that God does dispatch angels to answer prayer. We have examples of that in both the Old and New Testaments. I'm also not saying that God does not honor obedient faith, and the fact that a woman does not cut her hair is evidence of her obedient faith. However, 1 Corinthians 11:10 doesn't say anything about angelic power. The text doesn't say anything about miraculous power. In fact, the word power is not the best translation. The Greek word in this text is exousia, which refers to authority, not miraculous power. Also, notice carefully that the text does not say that a woman shall have power on her head because of her long hair. The text also does not say that a woman shall have power with the angels. The text simply says because of the angels. And lastly, the text does not say anything about wearing your hair up or letting your hair down. Before we dig a little deeper into this text, let's look at what a couple of our prominent UPCI scholars say about this text. The first one we'll look at is David Bernard, and there's not a Oneness Pentecostal in the history of the 20th and 21st century Oneness Pentecostals as well known as Dr. David Bernard. Dr. Bernard, even before he was the general superintendent, was the face of 20th century Oneness Pentecostalism. In 2009, in a paper entitled The Bible's Teaching About Hair Length, Culture or Command for the UGST Symposium, concerning 1 Corinthians 11:10, Dr. Bernard wrote, if a woman is living by faith and following God's will in her life, of which her long hair is one symbol, she can pray with confidence. However, there is no magic formula in prayer that enables us to obtain whatever we want when we want. So, obedient faith is one thing. And when we pray, we can pray with confidence. Now, we can't make demands, but we can be confident. But obedient faith is not a magic formula for prayer. And at that same symposium in 2009, Dr. Daniel Seagraves, in his article, Letting Our Hair Down, another look at 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16, stated, we have no biblical precedent for a woman letting down her hair as a confirmation of consecration or to express and focus her faith. So this isn't just some things that Brother Weatherly is coming up with. These guys are well respected UPCI theologians. Dr. Seagraves in 2009 also wrote an article for the Pentecostal Herald entitled Another Look at 1 Corinthians 11:10, a plea for caution, in which he states, it may seem beside the point to say that there is no reference here to a woman's hair, how a woman's hair is arranged, but some are teaching that the power of a woman's long hair in the spirit realm is especially heightened if it is down or loosed. If a woman's long hair truly did give her power over evil spirits, it's difficult to see how this power would be enhanced by the arrangement of her hair. So, what I'm telling you today is in agreement with the top scholars of our movement. And we've had some very well meaning preachers and authors. They've advocated and instructed women to let their hair down in prayer to summon miraculous angelic power, but that is not even remotely what this text says or teaches, and two of our prominent UPCI scholars agree. So you might be asking yourself, well, what exactly does the passage mean? Okay, well, let's take a look at some things. First of all, for this cause, dia tuta in Greek, which means for this reason or because of this. Well, because of what? Well, the phrase dia tuta points us back to what Paul just said about the order of creation. The woman came out of the man, not the man out of the woman. And the woman was created on account of the man, not the man on account of the woman. So everything in this verse is qualified by the order of creation. The word power in this verse is exousia, not dunamis. So the passage is not talking about authority, or the passage is talking about authority, not miraculous power. And most modern English translations render this passage as authority upon her head. Now, the interesting thing here is that Paul plays a little word game. Notice 1 Corinthians 11:10 says, for this cause ought a woman to have authority on her head. And so this stands in contrast to verse 7, where Paul said, for a man ought not to cover his head. So whatever a man ought not do, a woman ought to do. And in the entire context, we are talking about hair. What Paul did here is called a synecdoche, which is a figure of speech where one thing represents the entirety of something. It's like circumcision represents the entire Abrahamic covenant, or the lamb represents the entire Passover covenant. So here in 1 Corinthians 11:10, long hair represents the man's authority upon the woman's head. In other words, short hair on a man is a sign of Christ's authority in his life. Holy Spirit filled men keep their hair short to show that we are under Christ's authority. And in the same way, a woman allows her hair to grow without cutting it to show that she is submissive to the man's authority. And that man is either her father or her husband. If you're not a woman's father or husband, you're not the head of anybody. So, what does the phrase because of the angels mean? Well, honestly, we really don't know. It could be that Paul was referencing something from the Corinthian letter, but there are two very prominent views. The two most prominent views on this are number one, that Paul was referring to evil angels, the sons of God in Genesis 2, who saw the beauty of the daughters of men and married them and had supernatural demigod children called Nephilim. Now, the problem with this, though, is that Paul never uses the word angels to mean evil angels. When Paul refers to evil angels, he used the word daimon or demon, or the text specifically indicates that the angels were evil. Number two, the number two prominent view is that because of the angels is a reference to the seraphim in Isaiah 6 and 2 who covered their faces in the presence of God. And this kind of makes sense in that the seraphim have a natural covering of wings and women have a natural covering of hair. But what we do know is that the verse is not talking about women letting their hair down to invoke the miraculous power of angels. It's not anywhere in the context. In 1 Corinthians 11:3, Paul said, "Judge among yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God uncovered?" This is the same Greek word Paul used in verse 5. And this is a rhetorical question that Paul assumed his readers would commonly understand. So, in response to his own rhetorical question concerning whether or not it is proper for a woman to pray unto God uncovered, Paul answered this statement or answered this question with a statement concerning hair. Does not even nature teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a shame unto him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. So get that. The climax of Paul's teaching as to the properness of a woman praying to God uncovered is that long hair is given to a woman for a covering. Thus, a woman's long hair fulfills the injunction of let her be covered. When a woman refrains from cutting or trimming her hair, she has fulfilled the apostolic biblical mandate of having her head covered. 1 Corinthians 11:15 says, "But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her." Now, in English, we think of this statement as a verb and noun, long hair being a noun, but in Greek, this is not the case. The entire phrase have long hair is translated from one Greek verb, kamao. Kamao in 1 Corinthians 11:15 is a present active verb in the subjunctive mood. This is referred to as the progressive present tense. And when a progressive present tense verb is used in the subjunctive mood, it denotes a continuous action. Daniel Wallace, in his Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics, page 518, says that the progressive present normally involves continuous action. Bill Mounts, in Basics of Greek Grammar, page 289, calls this the present continuous subjunctive. In other words, kamao, or have long hair, in 1 Corinthians 11:15, is talking about a woman allowing her hair to continuously grow long. The only way for a woman to allow her hair to continuously grow long is for her to have uncut hair. Kamao refers to the natural uncut length of her hair. You see, ladies, have long hair is not a number on a tape measure. When you allow your hair to grow continuously without cutting it, it doesn't matter if it comes to your shoulders, it's still long hair. If it grows to the middle of your back, it's long hair. If it hangs to the ground and drags out your tracks, it's long hair. Have long hair refers to a woman allowing her hair to continuously grow without cutting it. Let me show you what the Greek dictionaries say about kamao, or have long hair. Notice the Bauer-Danker lexicon defines kamao as wear long hair, let one's hair grow. Thayer's lexicon says to let the hair grow, have long hair. Dr. Friedrich Prieseke, who was a German scholar of the Greek papyri, he stated that the verb kamao means to wear one's hair uncut. And his work is cited by Little and Scott, Bauer's Lexicon, and Moulton and Milligan, and a host of other Greek scholars. And then Lou and Nita explain in their definition of kamao in 1 Corinthians 11:15 that in a number of languages it may be necessary to translate kamao as to let one's hair grow long or not to cut one's hair. Now, understand, Lou and Nita were not oneness Pentecostals, so the idea that have long hair refers to uncut hair is not exclusively a oneness Pentecostal view. In fact, most denominations used to preach this. Let me show you some of their commentaries from denominational preachers. The Schaff-Herzog Encyclopedia of Religious Knowledge. Philip Schaff was a Presbyterian, and Johann Herzog was a Swiss German Protestant. Both of these men were translators of the American Standard Version, and they state that a woman's hair was never cut, and long hair was their greatest ornament. And then they cite 1 Corinthians 11:15. John Gill, who was an English Baptist, his comments on 1 Corinthians 11:15 are, if a woman has long hair and wears it without cutting it, as men do. Dr. Philip Brown, who is a Wesleyan Methodist and is the professor of language, Bible, and theology at God's Bible School and College in Cincinnati, Ohio, commenting on the use of the word kamao in early Greek literature, he then gives the comment. Given that understanding, 1 Corinthians 11:6 would read, if a woman does not have uncut hair, then let her shear the rest off. But since it is a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her allow her hair to grow uncut. Paul Butler, who is of the Disciples of Christ Christian church denomination, states, the expression long hair means let the hair grow. Hair is either natural length or not. We either let our hair grow or we do not. We either cut it or we do not cut it. John Rice, who was an independent fundamentalist Baptist, founding editor of the Sword of the Lord magazine, commenting on 1 Corinthians 11:15, he stated, God does not say how many inches long hair should be, but simply indicates that it should be left uncut. And then E.M. Zur, who was a commentator from the Church of Christ Campbellite denomination, contributor to Truth magazine, he stated, by long hair, the Lord means hair that is as long as nature makes it. If a woman cuts any of her hair, she also ceases to have long hair. So, this understanding that kamao or have long hair refers to uncut hair is not exclusively a oneness Pentecostal doctrine. Scholars of various denominations also understood that kamao refers to long, uncut hair. So, moving on, we know for sure that a woman is not required to wear a veil because, in response to Paul's own rhetorical question as to whether or not it is proper for a woman to pray unto God uncovered, Paul clarified that a woman's hair is given to her for a covering, or more specifically, instead of a veil. Most translations simply render 1 Corinthians 11:15 as for her hair is given for a covering or as a covering, but these two prepositions have a wide semantic range. The preposition used in Greek is anti, which refers primarily to replacement or exchange instead of or in place of. Vine's expository dictionary defines the preposition anti as in the majority of the occurrences in the New Testament, the idea is that of in the place of, instead of, or of exchange. The ideas of substitution and exchange are combined. For example, in Luke 11:11, a fish for a serpent. So in 1 Corinthians 11:15, where the hair is a substitute for the covering. G.B. Weiner's Grammar of the Idiom of the New Testament says ante, of which the local meaning is before, in front of, over against, denotes figuratively barter, exchange, and which one thing is given for instead of another, and in consequence assumes its place. It governs the genitive, that being the case of exchange. For example, 1 Corinthians 11:15, her hair for instead of a covering, to serve her as a covering. So when a translation or a lexicon says for or as, it's talking about an exchange. For, as, instead of a covering. In fact, several translations render this passage as instead of or in place of. For example, the Apostolic Bible Polyglot says, for the hair of the head instead of a wrap is given to her. The Aramaic Bible in plain English states, because her hair is given to her in place of a covering. The International Standard Version says, since the hair is given as a substitute for covering. The Darby translation has, for long hair is given to her in lieu of a veil. The Orthodox Jewish Bible has, because the long hair has been given to her instead of the kerchief or head covering. R.A. Knox's translation of the Latin Vulgate says that because her hair has been given her to take the place of a veil. So you see, this passage teaches that nature has given a woman long hair instead of or to take the place of a veil. So let me give you a plain illustration of what 1 Corinthians 11:15 means. Suppose someone asks me for $1. Maybe he wants a snack out of a vending machine or something. So I reach into my pocket and I pull out 4 quarters. And I give them 4 quarters for $1. So we could say 4 quarters ante $1 bill are given to him. We could say 4 quarters for $1 bill are given to him. Or we could say 4 quarters as $1 bill are given to him. We could even say 4 quarters instead of $1 bill are given to him. 4 quarters in the place of $1 bill are given to him. Or 4 quarters to serve as $1 are given to him. In each scenario, 4 quarters have taken the place or assumed the place of $1 bill. In every case, do you know what's been given to him? 4 quarters. He hasn't been given 4 quarters and $1 bill. He has been given 4 quarters for or instead of $1 bill. So apply the same concept to 1 Corinthians 11:15. Long hair ante a veil is given to her. Long hair for a veil is given to her. Long hair as a veil is given to her. Long hair instead of a veil is given to her. Long hair in place of a veil is given to her. Or long hair to serve as a veil is given to her. No matter how you translate it, just like with the 4 quarters scenario, it's the same. The woman's long hair assumes the place of the veil, and all that is required of the woman is what has been given to her, and that is her long hair. So I want you to notice another passage and think this through. 1 Timothy 2:8 through 9, another passage that deals with women's hair. Paul said, I will therefore that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands. In like manner also, so this connects the women to praying everywhere, lifting up holy hands. In like manner also that women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with propriety and moderation, and not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly array. So notice that, not with braided hair. Well, why in the world is Paul concerned about a woman's hair during prayer time if supposedly first century Christian women fully covered their heads with a veil? Who could have seen their hair? How would Paul know it was braided? The presence of a prohibition of such a hairstyle argues forcibly that it was in fact being worn in churches and that it was visibly seen by everyone. This in turn implies that there was not a doctrine of women wearing veils. Otherwise, how would Paul know that women wore braided hair? And scholars contend that First Timothy was written about 10 years after First Corinthians. So apparently the women in Ephesus weren't wearing veils during prayer time, or Paul wouldn't have known they had braided hair. Notice the parallel teaching of Peter, written some 13 years after Paul wrote First Corinthians. 1 Peter 3 and 3, whose adorning let it not be that outward adorning of plaiting the hair. And this is once again in the context of the time of prayer, 1 Peter 3 7. So notice that outward adorning. How can plaiting the hair be an outward adorning if supposedly Christian women fully covered their heads with a veil? The point is, they didn't. If women went around praying with a veil over their head, then the veil would have been their outward adorning, not their plaiting of the hair. It wouldn't be necessary to warn against women wearing a particular hairstyle if their hair was being covered by a shawl or a veil. And so, again, this shows conclusively that apostolic women were not going around wearing veils. Otherwise, why would there be a prohibition against the outward adorning of plaiting the hair? So, in the context of 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul is talking about the outward symbol, the sign of authority on a woman's head, the sign that she is in submission to her authority. And all of it goes back to headship. Spirit filled men wear their hair short to honor their head, which is Christ, and spirit filled women allow their hair to grow long to show their submission not only to their head, their husband or their father, but to Christ, the head of all men. Paul, after this, turns his attention back to the division in the church that he first mentioned in chapter 1, and how these divisions really reflect in the worship service, particularly in the partaking of the Lord's Supper. Paul says, therefore, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in eating, each one takes his own supper ahead of others, and one is hungry and another is drunk. What? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? Now, Blomberg comments, instead of sharing in a kind of potluck and ensuring that all get plenty to eat and drink, some gorge themselves and get drunk at the expense of others who come later or have less. Jude 12 seems to reflect and address a similar problem, and it uses the popular early Christian term love feast for these communal meals. Now, Paul doesn't object to the well to do enjoying or a reasonable quantity or quality of food in the privacy of their own homes, but in the church setting, they're satisfying themselves at the expense of the have nots proves singularly inappropriate. As an interesting little side note from the context that some were getting drunk in the observance of the Lord's Supper, Blomberg points out the cup that was drunk after supper would probably have been the third of 4 cups of wine consumed during the Passover meal, again with redemptive implications. This was the point of the ceremony at which the words, I redeem you, from Exodus 6:6 were read. There is no chance that unfermented beverage was poured into the cup, since some who drank excessively were getting drunk. The Passover celebration is not held in a time in which fresh, unfermented grape juice is available without the help of some process like pasteurization, which wasn't even invented until the late 1800s. Even if remotely possible, the Jews never incorporated any kind of process of trying to keep the juices from fermenting. The bottom line is the Jews drink fermented wine for Passover, and the early church, until the end of the 19th century, drank wine for communion. In fact, if you take one of Dr. Robin Johnston's courses on modern day Pentecostalism, you will learn that early Oneness Pentecostals were distinguished from the Trinitarian Pentecostals on two primary points: water baptism, invoking the name of Jesus, and taking wine for communion. We even found a reproduction of G.T. Haywood's recipe for communion wine while digging through some boxes at the Center of Oneness Pentecostalism about 4 years ago. I took a picture of it and I've got it saved on an old computer somewhere. In verses 27 through 34, Paul draws out the implication for the Corinthians of his appeal to tradition. He says, "For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes. Therefore, whoever eats this bread or drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord." Jesus' self giving love for them makes the behavior that much more shameful. In an unworthy manner, in verse 27, translates the Greek verb anasiax, unworthily. Paul does not use the adjective unworthy, which would have referred to a person's character, but highlights instead the nature of their actions. Thus, his warning was not to those who were leading unworthy lives and longed for forgiveness, but to those who were making a mockery of that which should have been the most sacred and solemn by their behavior at this meal. Paul continues, "For he who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner eats and drinks judgment to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. For this reason, many are weak and sick among you, and many sleep. For if we would judge ourselves, we would not be judged." Now, there's been a long debate among Protestants, especially Reformed Protestants, over the communion elements and how much more than representative they are. Martin Luther preached what is commonly called the real presence in communion. In other words, Luther and several Reformed denominations teach that Christ's presence is real in the communion elements of the bread and the wine. Now, we're not talking about transubstantiation like the Catholic Church teaches, that the wafer and the wine literally become the flesh and blood of Christ. But what Luther taught was that the bread and wine were more than just memorial symbols, which is what Zwingli and the Anabaptists taught. In fact, this is one of the few issues that Zwingli and the Anabaptists agreed upon. Now, part of Luther's and others' teaching on the real presence stems from Paul's warning here that in eating and drinking the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner, that many of the Corinthians were in fact weak and sick or sleep, a euphemism for being dead. In other words, eating and drinking this bread and wine was more than just a symbolic partaking of two elements. In some ways, the Lord's Supper is comparative to water baptism, in that baptism is not simply a symbol of being buried with Christ, because according to Galatians 3:27, it is putting on Christ. And through repentance, faith, and invocation of the name of Jesus, baptism, this symbolic act of being dunked underwater, communicates the remission or washing away of sins, Acts 2:38 and Acts 22:16. And so, because of the judgment aspect of taking communion in an unworthy manner, some teach, including some Oneness Pentecostals, that Jesus' presence is real in partaking of the communion elements. You may say, well, I've never heard that before in Pentecost. Well, you may not have, but typically, those in Pentecost who teach the real presence view are also big sticklers for foot washing and wine for communion, which again was the norm in the early 20th century Pentecostal movement. So, again, a lot to unpack throughout uh, this lesson. So, your food for thought, there's got three different things you can discuss in the forums. Number one, you could discuss headship and hair. Did Paul require women to wear a second covering, like a veil or a scarf? Or is Paul talking about a woman's long hair? You can discuss how long is long. Discuss whether Paul instructed women to allow their hair to grow uncut or whether it's allowable for women to trim their hair. To support your thoughts with scriptures. You may even choose to discuss 1 Corinthians 11:10 because of the angels. What exactly does that phrase mean? Does it mean or imply a type of angelic power through a woman's long hair? Discuss any pros and cons with this view, and again, support your thought with scriptures. Or you might choose to discuss 1 Corinthians 11:29 through 31 and the implications of judgment with taking the Lord's Supper. Are the elements of the Lord's Supper merely symbolic, or is Christ's presence real in the communion service? Have you ever heard of the real presence view of communion before? What about the practice of foot washing with communion? Back your thoughts with scriptures, and I look forward to interacting with you in the forums. God bless.